you all for kind of joining us today, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Mark Wilkinson from the James Hutton Institute. Dr. Wilkinson is a senior research scientist in catchment hydrology and the co-director of the Climate Positive Farming Initiative. A lot of kind of Dr. Wilkinson's work is very central to natural flood management development and evaluation in the UK, particularly things like the Belford Burn catchment in Northumberland, as well as kind of the Working with Natural Processes Evidence Directory produced by the UK Environment Agency. And his work is kind of a great example of moving hydrology from field-based evidence to real-world implementation. And I'm very grateful to welcome him today to give this talk. So please take it away, Mark.
Thank you very much. So that's great. Thanks for the introduction. So I am going to be talking quite a bit today about nature-based solutions, and in particular, I'll be talking about three different themes: NbS for floods, droughts, and water quality, and looking at how we can review existing measures to make them function better, giving examples. So a lot of the work I'll present is case-based examples where we've gathered information from to produce tools, evidence, and changes as well to measures and policy. I just want to start with this point about our catchments are facing many water-related issues, many of which you're all aware of. It's either too much, too little, maybe a bit like that now at the moment, or too dirty. So it's how do we deal with these issues within catchment? So nature-based solutions, well, it was really nice you put that introduction of maybe the sort of terminology debate going on. Natural flood management certainly used heavily, but NbS is starting to come a bit strongly into sort of the terminology here to capture more of the wider benefits behind these types of working with natural processes intervention. But it's like real societal challenge really, and how you can benefit both humans and biodiversity with these. So there's lots of potential for these solutions. I think we know the sort of theory behind many of them. It's good, but NbS rollout is quite slow. And actually, in some cases, quite a few cases, measures maybe are not fully working to their full potential. So how do we look at that optimization of their benefits? So how can we enhance the benefits, improve implementation? And I'm going to focus quite heavily on the agricultural landscape here today. I'm going to be looking at lowland and upland examples. So it will be a strong focus on agricultural today. So first, what I want to do is understand that these issues occur in, hold on, that's better, something popped up. These issues can occur in the same place at different times. So it's this idea of, well, we just had a conversation there about sort of Scotland. I mean, people think Scotland is quite a wet place. We have an abundance of rain, but actually our future projections for low flow, the northeast of Scotland has projections to be quite water scarce in the future. And that's quite of a concern because in the northeast of Scotland, we have lots of intense agriculture, but also distilleries as well. So there's a few vital industries relying on that. But to understand this issue, especially in terms of flooding and water management in the landscape, there we go, it needs a sort of whole catchment perspective looking at these multiple issues. And how I'm trying to frame that here is that we are seeing increasing hydrological extremes. And with these increasing hydrological extremes, such as floods, that's more intense rainfall, you're getting fast erosive flow pathways. This is an example from our sort of research catchment and neighbouring fields. You can see there that Storm Babette taking a gully out of 3 meters. Potatoes as well, you can see how much soil being lost there. And so we're having soil loss, floods, droughts, water quality issues. So that photograph on the left, is there a link to, say, flooding? Well, yes, there is. And actually, the muddy floods that you get in villages is that valuable soil being lost for farmland. So we need a way to sort of keep that soil within the fields, either through good soil management, but also disconnecting flow pathways. There's also a reflection here that floods and droughts are two sides of the same coin. What I'm trying to communicate here is that, for example, one of our biggest events in the northeast of Scotland in Aberdeenshire was Storm Babette in 2023, thereabouts, a couple of years ago. And in that event, we had 200 millimeters in a 3-day period. That's nearly 20% of our yearly average rainfall falling in the space of 3 days. Now, what we're seeing with our trends in rainfall is the yearly averages are not really increasing drastically. I'd be ever so slight increase of rainfall, even decreases, but generally that yearly average is not changing. What is changing is the intensity when that rainfall comes. So we have intense storms and long dry periods. So if something like Storm Babette here, that runoff occurs in a short period of time, that water is just rushing off the landscape out to sea and not getting the chance to recharge. So in a way, we need to hold water better in our catchments to allow better management for droughts and therefore water scarcity issues. So therefore, that link about how these intense storms, when they fall in our landscapes, how do we understand that process? Well, this is work we did over 10 years ago in terms of looking at the risk of flooding from agriculture. So this is a risk matrix, and there's two key parts to the story here. That is your soil infiltration, storage and tillage regime. And if you have bad soil management coupled with highly connected flow pathways, such as steep slopes, convergent flow pathways, you have a high risk of flooding. Compared to good soil management with less flow connectivity, you have a low risk. So just simple messages like this about the importance of soil management and connectivity is a good way to communicate that risk of flooding and how to deal with this. And well, I'm going to focus quite heavily today on the flow connectivity side of the story rather than soil management. Soil management is very important, and I'll touch on that in terms of the importance of infiltration, especially for low flows later. But for that flood story, it's that flow connectivity. So with that, what measure can we put in place to manage flow pathways? Well, getting that right measure in the right place is a key thing we need to better. And there are lots of existing measures out there. And one of the key ones out there for managing flow pathways is buffering, riparian or edge of field buffers. Here's some examples at the bottom. It could be a riparian buffer or an edge of field buffer. And the idea is the flow that flows over the farm fields here flows through this rough zone, and it intercepts that, stopping the water getting into the streams. But are they really working very well? Well, for flood management, there's quite a number of cases where the grass buffer is not an ideal measure. And you can see from these examples where water is just flowing to the corn and trickling through high speed and even subsurface drains. So how can we enhance the benefit of this measure for flooding? And back in 2017, we started to explore this concept with Forest Research, Environment Agency, the concept of a 3D buffer. And that's going from at the top there, a 6 meter, this was the sort of the width we're looking at here, standard grass buffer, and looking at the adding more structure to it, going down with an increasing amount of engineering, and looking at the wider benefits that you could get from that. And the core message is, as you go down this with C, D, and E, you get more benefits. Also, wooded buffers give you lots of benefits too. So this concept of a 3D buffer, we've highlighted that you can improve conventional grass buffers by putting a mix of multiple measures to maximize the benefits and targeting the design of these for the environmental issue of concern. For example, if you have a high nitrate issue coming from subsurface flow pathways, you could break that field drain and create a mini wetland through an engineered buffer approach. In the past year, this measure has now entered into the higher tier English scheme. So it's great to see that now in there as a measure that could be taken on board. But I just want to now sort of focus on what are the important design criteria of these sort of engineered, this sort of 3D buffer approach for flooding. And the core thing to manage flooding is this idea of having temporary storage. So new storage areas available during flood events. So the idea is creating temporary storage areas that if heavy rainfall were to occur, you can store it temporarily, allow it to drain to give resilience for the next flood events to come. But the key thing is here, as scale increases, so too does the amount of storage mitigation required. And Martin Roberts, a researcher at Hutton, looked at this during his PhD. He looked at about 7 UK case studies here, and looking at the importance of temporary storage for mitigating flood risk. And there is a bit of a relationship going, you can see here, amongst UK case studies. So what we're looking at the bottom there is the total temporary storage area volume, and we've standardized that per kilometre squared, so meters cubed per kilometre square, and up the y-axis peak flow reduction. And then on here, we're also looking at whether it's empirical model study and the size of the flood event it can mitigate. And generally, the core highlight from this graph is there is a relationship here with increasing volume and peak flow reduction. So generally, we're looking there at around about 2,000 cubic meters per kilometre squared storage to reduce flood peak by 10% for these case studies. Now, if that equated in terms of areas, as it's a World Cup, let's talk football pitches. So for a catchment, we've say that's about 160 football pitches in an area. That equates to about an area of half a football pitch to give 50 centimeters worth of depth. So and that could be dispersed across many fields. So it shows you can actually maximize the sort of spread of the storage and have an impact on flooding. But still, there's plenty of space to do this. It's just trying to work with farms and design to get that storage within catchments. So what do they look like? Well, these are examples of raised field margins on the edge of fields. They bring other benefits like that one in Balrhodry Farm, our research farm in Angus. You can see quite a substantial amount of sediment that's been captured there, which we can capture and then re-plough back into the farm. Same with the Tarland one there in Aberdeenshire. You can see a large amount of soil sediment being captured there. These measures have been monitored, and that has been really vital information to understand the functioning of that measure. And one thing we've been quite keen to do, and Martin looked at in his PhD, is to try and see, well, is that pond working to its optimum? Is it under-designed or is it over-designed? And it's this important message of what is the correct design to mitigate flooding. So if we take this feature here, which helped to inform a lot of the evidence, Martin and the team of us developed this decision support tool called TSA DOT, and it allows us to give site-specific design guidance to optimize the performance from flood mitigation within fields. And first, what it does is looks at the criteria, and it takes a set of criteria from a field to help you look at the optimal design of the feature. So first, it takes a near surface runoff, Q in, flow in, and then it looks at the site-specific characteristics of the feature. The important ones here being the bund height, the TSA, temporary storage area height, and therefore the storage capacity that gives you. The next important characteristic is that pipe, the important pipe to allow it to drain for flood, to allow that storage for the following flood events. Now you can put that pipe low in the bund or high. You might want to put it higher if you want to collect more sediment to get sedimentation. If that's not an issue, put it low to allow it to drain. What is also vital is the infiltration data as well. So how the soil can cope. And again, we've done some research here looking at the importance of soil management within the footprint as well. And there we look at Q out as well from this feature, and a small role of evapotranspiration, although it's considered in this tool as well. And then what that does is you can then customize this to get flood mitigation metrics, and therefore assess and rank the most effective design for a bund. The tool is on GitHub. It runs in R and it's available to download. There's a paper link to this. And the example here is from that Tarland bund. So this is run through hundreds of the different design criteria, which I just went through there. And if we look at that left-hand side column, this is for the 2023 Storm Babette. And we've got our original design in there. It's a bund, not very high, 40 centimeters high, really quite low. And it gives us about 200 cubic meters of storage. And what we can kind of see is it's working well, the current design. We've designed that quite well. The optimal design would be a little bit higher, a wee bit more storage. And we're getting a little bit of overtopping, as you can see in the middle plot there. But what is interesting is the future scenarios. And what we did here is just increasing rainfall. And if we go to that far one, if we were to have an intensity of 40% more rainfall in the future, the original design is not good enough, and therefore an optimal design would be making it 1 meter high, more storage capacity to get an impact there, and no overtopping. So the key thing here, what we're trying to do is to get an optimal design so we don't under-engineer it, i.e. it overtops all the time, because the core message here is a full pond is not that effective. We need some sort of storage to mitigate. But we don't want to over-design it, build a bund that's too big, because then we're putting all our investment into the wrong into one place when we could spread that investment out across different fields. So that's a TSA.tool, and also work from Alex Nicholson, Bolkman, myself, and others. This is the Belford example, which a few of you might have seen this plot before from the 2019 paper, but this is for offline storage ponds. That is ponds next to the stream. Where we showed in this example a network of 35 ponds, 400 cubic meters in storage can give you about a 30% flood peak reduction, assuming we had the land to do that. But the key thing about these TSA areas is the land can still be managed if you want to, or become an ecological zone, so you could decide the extra benefits you wish to get from that. We always worked that volume up to about 10,000 cubic meters. And guidance on the construction is essential as well here. But that question mark in the stream is, well, how can we optimize the spill from the stream into the offline storage areas? And a key method to do that is a leaky barrier. So that takes me nicely onto sort of looking at woody leaky barriers. Although I won't talk too much about how we can use a leaky barrier to spill into the into offline ponds. I'm going to talk about the functioning of leaky barriers as themselves as a sort of mitigation measure for flood risk. I'll then move on to look at them for water quality and then low flow management. So what they're trying to do is mimic natural wood accumulations. They have been known to reduce small flood peaks and could help sustain base flow, capture coarse and fine sediment. And I kind of think this is kind of one of the most popular NFM measures maybe across the UK. There seems to be many examples of this type of intervention, probably because it's easy to install and it's quite cheap, and the guidance is kind of flexible how they're used, as long as you don't restrict flow pathways in main water courses, allow sort of migratory fish passage. So it's a popular measure, but again, are these working to their full potential for the issues of concern? Well, we looked at a case study of leaky barrier implementation in a steep headwater catchment in the Borders in Scotland. And you can see the design of them there in the bottom. It's quite similar to a lot of leaky barriers. And again, this is an environment where leaky barriers are popular because it's low productivity agricultural land. So usually farmers say, these work there, that's okay, compared to maybe more valuable lowland land. But what we found is through empirical evidence assessments and modelling studies here in this paper by Steve Addy, led by Steve Addy, these leaky barriers didn't really have an effect on peak flow travel time and rate, and they didn't really work too well in the extreme flood events. And that was really down to the hydrological effects are limited due to the steep channel. There wasn't much storage there. And again, the velocity reduction, they were getting bypassed quite a bit. So there's a lack of expandable out-of-bank storage. And again, that key message here about the interaction between leaky barriers and storage is key. So if these measures are being implemented, there could be a lot whereby maybe they're not doing anything bad, but maybe their effectiveness is on the lower end. They're not really working to their full potential. And that's important maybe when we get into private financing, because it shouldn't be about number of leaky barriers, it should be about the quality. So it's about quality rather than quantity of this type of measure. So we're looking to improve the design functioning of these types of interventions. And one place we're doing this is at our climate positive farming initiative. So the climate positive farming initiative, which is based at the James Hutton Institute, is looking at this idea of how can farming be reach net zero, have good water management, biodiversity landscapes, and still be profitable. So this is our research farm up in Aberdeenshire. It's a 1,000-hectare upland farm, and we've been able to test different nature-based solution approaches, which I'm going to give 2 examples of here in the next couple of slides, amongst many other things. And I could talk to quite length about each of these. For example, we're just about to finish a hydrogen production facility for small-scale hydrogen on farms. We also do agroforestry, woodland, peatland trials here as well. So it's a core hub for this type of approach. But just up my mouse is showing, we've got we benefit in these 2 tributaries from 30 years of hydrological data through the Environmental Change Network. And this catchment is sort of our control, no land use change, but this one has been mitigated with leaky barriers and woodland planting. So we get a backy type experiment here, but before after control intervention experiment. Sorry, I'll just take a drink. So here is our experimental design. And what we've done here is actually just optimized by extending the length of these leaky barriers out into the floodplain. So in these types of environments, we have these sort of mini pockets of sort of storage. And what we're trying to do is push water to where it hasn't gone to before. We have to acknowledge in big events that these areas do flood, but we're trying to push the flow further into this flood zone and also store it for a bit longer. So we're assessing that at the moment. You can see some visual images here of the flow being pushed further in an event here through our camera. Hydrological impact's being assessed at the moment, but I just wanted to show the morphological impact here and actually show that some of the core sediment issues, which can be an issue in these types of environment, we're actually now starting to accumulate more sediment on the floodplains rather than in the channel or further downstream. So these are having a positive effect on morphology at the moment, but this is all part of ongoing work. But we tend to think of leaky barriers mainly for floods only. But in these next couple of slides, I want you to maybe think about leaky barriers for water quality and drought management. And one project we have ongoing with Rhizocore, Harper Adams and Cheshire Wildlife Trust is looking at fungi as a way to mitigate diffuse pollution issues on farms and then water channels. And what we're using here is white rot fungi, which is Earth's natural nutrient recycler. And it's been known to break down complex compounds and absorb them. It's known to absorb nitrate, phosphate, which is the 2 core things we're looking at here, but many other things, heavy metals, ammonia, organic molecules. So this is an Innovate UK funded project, but the idea here is we're collecting different types of fungi, looking at the sort of genetic makeup of local fungi, and testing these strains in lab conditions and inoculating it onto different media. So you get the fungi, you inoculate it onto media such as what you're seeing in the top image there is biochar, for example, on image A. But you could use wood chip, straw, locally from the farm. And then you can see these sort of inoculated media and test tubes there. And the lab results are really showing really positive results for nitrate reduction, high nitrate in, very low coming out. Phosphorus is still a bit of a tricky one, but we're now looking to do field trials on this. And this is an example of a leaky barrier bale put in our farm drain at Glen Sock. Now, the data is just starting to come out. I'm happy to pass on further details of the data, but this is a good site for testing sort of farmyard runoff mitigation and how we can use fungi as an end of pipe. And the idea is then you could take the fungi media out, and then we're looking at pot trials to see how that sort of mix works as sort of a compost to try and get a circular approach of our nutrients. So that's leaky barriers for water quality. And in the Cheshire Wildlife Trust and Harper Adams are trying to look at novel field trials down there for maybe attaching it to leaky barriers as well, so we can treat water quality at the same time. So this is ongoing work. Hopefully next time we present, we got some data to show you on that. So moving from floods to droughts, how can we use leaky barriers to mitigate low flows and river temperatures? And this is a view, if you're familiar with Speyside, it has a high density of distilleries, and that's the Glenlivet Distillery, which many of you might know. So we've been working ourselves with University of Aberdeen, Glenlivet Distillery, who's owned by Chivas Brothers, to look at safeguarding against prolonged warm and dry periods. The distillers are quite worried about this because there's two issues here. They're worried about climate projections of having less water in the summer, but they also need the water to be cool, because the cooling water is possibly it's the highest use of water in the distillery to cool it down. And these distilleries use lots of water. So it's not just about the water for making the product, this is more about the cooling water. So we need to use NbS to improve low flows, and we've been doing that in the small case study catchment, 0.5 square kilometers Speyside. And the measure of choice here is a leaky barrier in ephemeral channels, so not main channel. So trying to just hold water in upland ephemeral channels. So the concept we know quite well for NbS and NFM is this idea of you implement NbS and you reduce and delay the flood peak. But what we're trying to do for the low flow context here is have that water come back out in the future and have more of it available, and cooler as well, because if it comes from deeper sources, it inevitably will help us with river temperature. So we've implemented a trial of about 45 different leaky barriers across these ephemeral channels. We've used a mix of designs from wood, stone and earth dams. And we've been monitoring these for some time now. And you can see this is the water level data. The earth dams drain quicker through the phase, whilst the leaky barrier, the wood leaky barriers drain quicker compared to, say, the earth dams, which have a longer capacity. We've taken that data along with knowledge about the catchment, stable water isotope, and a paper here led by Jessica Fennell looked at this as part of her PhD. We implemented a Mike Shea 3D catchment model and integrated that with a river network model. So we put all this information into a model. And the reason why we want to use a model is to test different scenarios for the future. What is the best design of these NbS for low flows? So the type of scenarios we're looking at is how big, how many, and where. And the core scenarios we're looking at here were, well, what if we put the leaky barriers in freely draining soils compared to poorly draining soils? What if we put them throughout the river network everywhere? And the importance of scale. That option C is the current one. So first, let's have a look at what happened with the current setup in the model. And we're seeing that we're getting about a 1% change on low flows, the Q95. So that sounds very small. We've got to remember the volume is very small. You can see it there, hundreds of cubic meters. But for the distillery, that was really a positive result. That could help with 1 day's, if they have 7 consecutive days of low flow, they have to stop extraction. So if that helps to give resilience to reduce that, that's a big saving. The different scenarios, well, this is how they all plot. I'll take you through that in step by step. Firstly, soil type. Well, that's important. If you put the leaky barriers on freely draining soils, you get a better impact on low flows than on poorly draining soils. The spread is very important too. So to spread them across a catchment is better. And the theory there is that you are maximizing where the water is infiltrating across the catchment. So spread is very important, because as volume increases, the effect tends to taper out. And that's just due to the footprint becoming fully saturated. So therefore, that's why spread is more important here. We've also looked at the time variable effectiveness. Again, a tool here at the bottom paper. We've looked at a recession curve analysis here, and this looked at that through multiple different temporary storage area type features, but just focusing on the Glenlivet ones, we were able to find out that the wood ones hold water for approximately 40 hours, whilst the earth are about 60 hours till they're empty. But you might notice that actually the earth leaky barriers tend to drain slower than quicker. That's just because that first part, they're in network, so the top one's still draining into the second one. So that's why you see that the important part of that curve is the latter part. The bottom plot's possibly the most interesting, and I think it's the importance of temporal effectiveness. There's a sort of a theory here that we might be thinking we put NbR out and they're okay, but this highlights the importance of management and temporal effectiveness. NbS effectiveness changes through time, and you can see here through the earth leaky barriers, the drainage rate is becoming longer, and that's just due to the sedimentation in the footprint. So that shows us if we want it to be more effective, we're going to have to, for low flows and drainage, we're going to have to keep an eye on that year on year, because you can see that the infiltration rate is changing slightly there as we go on. Cost benefit, we looked at that. There is leaky barriers have been shown to be quite cost effectiveness for the distillery. For that point I highlighted that they're very cheap measures, hundreds of pounds to build, and it's a very large figure to stop production of a distillery for one day. And again, we produced a paper on this one as well. Future work, we have a new PhD student, well, not new, should be going, Jennifer's a couple of years in, looking at conceptual models and transferability, and she's investigating this in different distilleries across Speyside, and that work providing guidance to the wider industry and other stakeholders. So some concluding thoughts to end with. Well, firstly, I've presented a few measures, but there are many different measures you could implement in this is, for example, lowland agricultural intense catchment. This is a measure database we created for a project in Ireland for water quality, and these are all different types of intervention. And again, it gives you sort of effectiveness rating of each of these, how well they might perform. But there are different types of approach you can build. You can build more engineered ones, sort of that third column there, the bioreactors, integrated buffer zones, or go even more simple, such as wildflower buffers. But again, these can be targeted to that issue of concern. We've looked at the hierarchy system for measure placement, and we tend to put this into a 3-level system, with that first level being your default basic fixed width compliance buffer strip. Now, these are not very good for those convergent flow pathways. So you might want to maybe just put these on watercourses to stop livestock access, or just generally for compliance. But if you do have a more diffuse pathways, then forested or woodland buffers are really good for this, or that more magic margin type of approach. I add more topography and to deal with the diffuse. But as you get more again, you can put these down the slopes. But as you get more convergent flow pathways, as highlighted by these points, you can build in more bonded measures to temporarily disconnect those flow pathways. And if you have areas where there's field drains coming in or big issues, then you can go for a more engineered buffer type approach. So it's trying to manage our catchments for those multiple purposes. And one way we phrase this is for this catchment systems engineering approach. And we use that term engineering because it's a really nice word that really works well to design sort of interventions better in our landscape. So we're really looking at more softer end of engineering spectrum here, using the nature-based approach here rather than that traditional end of flood defences. But I'm just acknowledging here that we need every trick in the book to manage all these issues. So one thing I want to highlight here is NBS is not the silver bullet, and we still need traditional engineering to protect resilience to our sort of towns and cities infrastructure. But natural approaches certainly play an important role here. And then there's a spectrum here of that middle ground whereby you can have more software engineered types of approaches. So to conclude, design, location and scale matter for effectiveness. So getting that right design, the optimized, and putting that measure in the right place and making sure it's adequate to the scale of the catchment is important. there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach, and that therefore is you can't design a wetland to do flooding, water quality, biodiversity, sediment management. You can't do that. It's always going to have a benefit, more of a benefit for one thing than the other. So the way to solve this is a treatment train approach. So you could have an ecological zone wetland on a floodplain, and you could improve flood resilience by putting a bund around it to give it freeboard for a flood event. But then you don't want it to clog with sediment, so then you could bolt on a sediment trap to that. So it's about planning a treatment train approach. And therefore, if you do that, then it's getting you towards that right measure, right place approach. Finally, probably one of the most important slides. This has been a large team effort. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors, my colleagues, close colleagues working on all these projects. A big thanks to them and the funders. There's some websites, QR codes there for the various links to the projects. So big thanks to them, and I'll take any questions.
Sweet, thank you, Mark. That was fantastic. And if people would like to you have two options. You can either post it to the Q&A conversation and then I'll read them out if you're not feeling brave, or if you're feeling brave, if you just raise your hand and then I'll allow you to unmute yourself and then you can speak of whatever you want to speak to. I'll start with a question from my end while people start to get their hands up or put questions together. And it was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. But something that you didn't touch on much was around kind of flood peak synchronization. And I wonder, is there much consideration or is there much research at James Hutton Institute going into how slowing the flow and storing and kind of having this slow release at different times impacts kind of flood peaks at different parts of the catchment? And the reason I ask is I was doing some work in the Cocker catchment, and what I found is that while certain areas that were important or considered important for protection received kind of a reduction in flood peak, there were areas actually closer to the site or before the site that actually received kind of negative impacts where it was a very minor increase in flood risk. I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and no, I didn't touch on the presentation, but yeah, it is work we do, and that issue of synchronization is something we always consider and communicate, again, because people think, well, can I do this here? But I think we need. You're right. The issue of synchronization makes us think about catchment and the processes. So in the past, yes, we have colleagues, myself, Paul Quinn, but there's also, when I was at Newcastle as well, Gareth Owen, the simple river network models were developed to look at this in Great Ayton through Gareth's work. But I maybe just want to reflect on that, because there is a few challenges behind the synchronization issue, and two spring to mind. And firstly, I've highlighted that flooding is not the sole concern in one catchment, and many other concerns. And one could be diffuse pollution. So what if that catchment close to the source is a source of diffuse pollution in the lower? I remember many catchments start in the hills, come down to lower parts. What if the lower one has a nitrate or phosphorus issue? You're going to deal with that with measures that are going to impact on flood risk. So you're going to have a conversation about, well, maybe we need to do something here. And what about that issue of synchronization? So there could be some trade-offs on that debate. But then to help the synchronization point two, I want to possibly make here is synchronization many times assumes the same uniform storm, but no storm is the same. And we've seen that a number of times. One catchment we've been working on, will work on more, is the South Esk. It's a key catchment, focus catchment for Scottish Government SEPA at the moment. And actually, we've had two big floods there. And the source catchments, the glens, in one flood event, most of the flooding came from one, and for another one, it came from another. So it just shows no flood's the same. So you've still got to tackle for that. And then the third issue is convective storm events. So you might have an issue where you get downpour close to a sort of a lower part. You still need to manage for that. So in a way, we might want to look at synchronization debate as a trade-off and still plan to mitigate everywhere. And I guess it's that idea, if we try and do it everywhere, we're still slowing the whole system down.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm in agreement, because often it's designed for one storm and you don't test all these different scenarios. It depends what the spatial representation of the rainfall. I completely agree. Ellis has put a question in the chat. It says, regarding the water quality tests, do you know the average residence time in the barriers? Is it long enough, and how effective is it in winter when processes are slower but volume throughput is probably higher?
It's a great question. Right, but this is the fungi work. You need, that is mainly effective for the lower flows. For flood flows, it usually bypasses. So for this type of work, it's going to be working for those lower flows. And for the higher flows, what we probably need is a treatment train, a sediment trap upstream to capture fine sediments, where we can collect those. So again, we need both. You're right. It's part of the Innovate UK type work here that naturally the fungi doesn't like to get too submerged, so you've got to keep it in shallow streams. And it doesn't work too well in winter. In fact, it went a bit slow in winter, so it might be better for the summertime. So yeah, we are learning about this. We do need to have it long enough. We need to make sure that the media is porous to allow it to trickle through. But we are starting to get an idea of the key design components you need for getting this in place. So yeah, there's a good point about the temperature. It has been more challenging in winter.
Yep. Perfect. I hope that answered your question, Ellis. And Maike, I'm sorry if I've said that wrong.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. I was wondering a bit on the social dimension. So did you also identify like some challenges in the implementation, or some, like what was the reaction, or did you hear of any reaction in other cases about the leaky dam measures?
From the farmers in terms of sort of like the implementation, yeah, we have a large social science team in the Hutton who've looked at barriers behind NFM. So it's been summarized as sort of 6 core areas there which concern them in a way. In terms of the financing of this as well, I think that's a key one. Where's the money to do this? I think one of the pertinent ones I've seen is evidence. They want to know it works and how well it's working. So if they're going to do this, many of the farmers I work with want to know the data to show it's working well. I think there is scope to do this. Again, I think it's down to trying to get these through funded measures, but also make sure there's maintenance behind that as well. There's no concern of the farmers about who's going to keep maintaining this or how we do that as well. I hope that helped us. Brief reflections. I could certainly talk quite a length of this. I can put you in touch with colleagues as well who are very interested in this topic.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Mike. Moses, go for it. Your mic is you can unmute it.
Thank you, Mark, for that impressive presentation. It's really good. But my concern is, with such a study, working with farmers, how do you manage land tenure? Because it's really a big issue in some areas. How do you manage that aspect?
The land tenure in terms of the permissions to do it? Is that what you're talking about there?
Yes. Yeah, in terms of, who owns the land? Is it a private land? Is it owned by the farmer? How do you manage it?
Okay, so there's quite a number of different angles that can come from here. I'll try and take the simple one in terms of the permission to do it. I think the first thing is, if you keep it small and dispersed, and maybe one reflection I was trying to get from my talk is, when we go into farms, we shouldn't talk about water. And actually, this is kind of a finding from a working group across Europe as part of Land for Flood. We shouldn't talk about water, we should talk about land and land take. And generally, farmers don't like measures which are taking lots of land, especially if it's not payment to it. But hopefully one concept I'm trying to communicate here is what we're trying to do is maybe squeeze that land take down. So when I present that level, maybe I didn't make that too clear, the level 1, 2, 3 approach. The level 3 approach, what we're trying to do, through optimization, we can actually reduce land take. And that is a good message to farmers. So if you take those temporary storage areas and that offline storage fund, the land take can be smaller than a 10-meter buffer. It's targeted to the corner of the field. But the larger flood inundation zone is only activated for maybe 1, 2 events of the year. We want to capture the bigger events, not the smaller. So therefore, the farmer can still farm that landscape if he wishes to, or she wishes to. So keeping it small is helpful. The trickier parts of the dimension of this is possibly the more issue around tenant farming and ownership. So you might have an owner of a farm who wants to do something, but the tenant farmers are not keen to do it, or vice versa. And that can make more complexities to it. But I think the simple issue is if you make it small, targeted, working with the farmer and co-develop the plan. So we tend to walk around farms and do these farm runoff management plans. It's more palatable. So you can work on private land if you talk about land as at the forefront of where things need to go. I don't see it as much of an issue. I think we just need sort of the mechanisms, the payment mechanisms to support that. But they are coming. I think it's great to see the 3D buffer approach in there. It gives more flexibility to people to think about this. But yeah, hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Mike has also asked, is there a paper that addresses the kind of limited land take stuff that you could link?
Yes, I'll try and find something from the Land for Flood group as well, where there's nice policy briefs on this importance of land. Actually, yeah, I can share the Irish work. We did some work with Irish EPA on smarter buffers. So yeah, it's covered in the section on that. I will share that in the chat just before I log off. So don't log off there.
Tim Marchbanks has asked a good question. He says, thanks for a really interesting talk. Great to see consideration of optimization. Lots of leaky barriers being installed, and currently I'm not sure that they do anything. Primarily it is still kind of single objective optimization. And have you considered kind of multi-criteria optimization with different co-benefits?
Yeah. I mean, I was quite focused there on small first order, second order channel spanning leaky barriers. There are many different types of wood design you could do here. I think that's quite an interesting point about how they work. I think you can design them differently. I did mention that storage is one criteria, but actually what we might see with leaky barriers is velocity reduction. They do smash the energy of flows and that important roughness. Yeah, I think the multi-criteria bit to consider here, especially with the ecology, is how they might could be used for creating different habitats, but also how you might make these barriers living as well, so you're not tied into fixing them again and again. That's a different phase of our work, to create the more willow living, which there's a few examples in England. Trying to remember the word it was again, but yeah, I do agree with that point. It is quite single objective, especially from an NFM criteria, and they could be optimized better to do this. Hopefully that answers that question. Again, another one we could go on for hours with.
Good. I have kind of one last question, and then I'll do a little final wrap up. But my last question is, recently a post note has come out around kind of NBS for flood and drought resilience, and in particular that kind of low flow drought resilience management. I think it's going to, I mean, given the weather outside in the UK right now, at least where I am, it's cooking everyone. And we're seeing kind of this increased risk of drought within peatland areas, which will obviously limit their effectiveness because you'll get wildfires that will have taken huge areas of land. Have you considered looking at what impact some of those kind of gully blocking or leaky barriers might have on things like deep peat kind of moisture recharge. Is there anything on that? Because I know that obviously with a lot of wildfires that happen in peatland, it goes all the way deep down. And if there's NbS solutions that could potentially reduce that risk, that'd be really interesting to know.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part. And again, I have colleagues looking at this, the important links between NbS for low flows, it's wetter, and that link with wildfire, because you are right, if you keep it wetter, you reduce your risk with wildfire. So there is research in Scotland on that. More needs to be done. But again, it's that optimization of benefits, because as I highlight with the leaky barrier work, I mean, it does help flow flows. The peatlands store water, but it can be better done on freely draining soils. So I showed that example. So it's maybe not the best place. Still has benefit, but you know, we can get better elsewhere. And again, the flood risk management side of things as well. I mean, peatland restoration has benefits for flood risk management. It might be a bit smaller than, say, river restoration of floodplain wetlands. I think there's research which have highlighted that the floodplain wetlands are give you a greater benefit, but that's not saying that peatlands don't. But I think all things point to peatland restoration being excellent for hydrology, carbon benefits, and as you say, if you keep it wet, it's better for the wildfire too. But then there's all sorts of other pressures on our environment as well, such as that wildfire, such as the fuel source, and how deer management might creep into this in sort of Scotland as well. It may not be too much of an issue in England compared to Scotland, but yeah, there's many interlinking pressures on our sort of environment, which makes it really of a challenge to develop these multi-issue solutions.
Yeah, really interesting. Zoe has asked a question. If I'll do it real quick, but it's how is beaver reintroduction fitting within this work? Because I feel like you hopefully have a quick answer for that.
So we've done work. Our beavers are great. I mean, they have local benefits. I think we need more work on the catchment scale benefits on this, but it's very similar to the principles of leaky barriers in terms of the beaver dam. My colleague Paul Quinn, he's not here today, so I can say this, would probably say with the leaky barrier work, his tagline is "We are the beavers." So we're trying to design and optimize the leaky barrier where it is, whilst you can't tell a beaver exactly what to do. In fact, it goes off. But the beaver introduction does fit with that, but it has a more complex social interaction, especially in Scotland, because our beaver reintroduction happened possibly in the worst place, in Tayside, the most intense agricultural landscape. So a lot of farmers are asking, well, you tell me beavers are an NbS measure, that's great, so where's the payment for it? And it's like, well, no, it's not payment. So it really is a difficult one there. The leaky barrier one is a bit more easier to work with, because you can work with the authorities to plan it. As I say, you can't plan a beaver, but beavers certainly have benefit for the environment and therefore fit into the story as well. Again, that would be another hour webinar on beaver, but yeah, lots of work going on in Scotland on this, and working groups on this as well, which I think colleagues in England are part of as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark. I'm just going to present a quick slide. Can everyone see? Oh, probably says preparing your slides, I think. But no, thank you so much for your talk, Mark. That was really interesting and great to hear everything about that, to be honest. I mean, I'm very interested in this space, and yeah, I've always thought around the kind of leaky barriers, it's entirely dependent on what soil you put them on, and the importance of where they're placed.
And indeed, if anyone's up in Scotland and wants a nice trip to some of these parts, be happy to show you around some of the good case studies up here. It's a cool place, remember. Apart from January, bring a picture up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. And our next talk, I think everyone, can you see my screen? Perfect. Yeah. Our next talk is from Professor Jochen Hack. He's kind of focuses on urban nature-based solutions for green infrastructure development. He's a professor of kind of climate resilience and urban water management, and led on a large project called Sea Urban Water. So if you want to look that up beforehand, So it'll be very different and kind of the opposite side from this talk, which is very agricultural and rural focused. The next one's very urban focused. So thank you for everyone for your time. I'm going to stop presenting if I can. I don't know how to, there we go. I'm going to stop presenting.